I do want to add to what Jenny was saying about the wetland delineation situation. Donna and I did go in and meet with staff, Donna on behalf of the Conservation Alliance and me on behalf of the Guardian, as they were developing all that language for the change in the LDR. And I'll tell you why we were particularly against the change that they were making. And that is, several years ago, many of you will remember one of the first urban boundary busters that we had was the trailside development. And at that particular site, there were a number of wetlands that had been illegally drained. We feel very confident they had been illegally drained. And we went in, we met with the staff, and they refused to acknowledge that those wetlands had been drained because we were not able to have gone in at that time because we didn't have the property owner's approval and delineate those wetlands. We showed them before aerial photos, after aerial photos, and it was unquestionable that those wetlands had disappeared and they had disappeared illegally. But because we had not been able to go through and say exactly what species of plant it was, they refused to take any sort of enforcement action. So when they made this recent change to the LDR, we went back in and we met with them again, and we said, what's going to prevent this from happening again? And I'm afraid there was no good answer. What's going to happen, and we feel pretty confident of this, we've got to figure out how to get ahead of the game, is that property owners who know sometime in the future they're going to want some development approval on their property, they are going to do those illegal things. Then when they do have to delineate the wetland because they're coming in for some sort of development approval, they will be required at that time to delineate where the wetland is, and by that time it'll be gone. We'll go back into the county and say, well, it was here 10 years ago, and they're going to say the same thing that they told us before. How can you prove to us that it was there? So I'm afraid we're in a bind there. We're trying to figure out how to get around that situation, but it's a very difficult one. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about water. And we're doing the same. Donna has orchestrated this to be the same as we have done in previous years, where Charles was telling us what's going on up there at the state level. We've got good information from Maggie and from Jenny about what's happening here locally. And then I've been asked to come in and try to keep you awake with some nice, pretty pictures that hopefully you'll be able to relate to some of the things that are going on here in Martin County. So on behalf of the Guardians, I'm here to talk about water. Several of you have been to the presentations that I've given on Martin at the Crossroads. And I thank several of you for opening some doors. David Shore is doing that with some of the WHAM folks. Others of you are also doing that. If you know some people who should see the Martin at the Crossroads presentation, feel free to talk with me afterwards and we'll try to get that scheduled. But we're going to talk about water. We're going to start off kind of at the high level, basic needs, what's going on at the state level, then what's going on here locally. And so as you see here, basic needs. Certainly water for people, whether they're private wells, public water supplies, or recreation. That's certainly number one in everybody's book. Water for agriculture, certainly number two. We've got a substantial proportion of Martin County in active, viable agriculture, whether it is sugarcane or citrus groves or row crops, still some flower farms around. We have to have the water for those entities. But unfortunately, what's happened in Florida is the environment has come last. And so when you have heard the words over the past couple of years about minimum flows and levels, the conservationists have gone to the state and the Water Management District and said, we cannot continue to be last on the bottom of the list here. We've got very valuable wetland systems like the Loxahatchee River that are suffering because they're at the end of the pipe. The ag folks have taken their water out, the other public users have taken theirs out, and the environment is suffering because of that. So in a stroke of the right kind of a decision by the legislature a number of years ago, they required that the water management districts come in and go through a methodical process of identifying minimum flows and levels. And so for us here, the one river that has been established for is the Loxahatchee. And essentially says that even during the driest time of the year, you have to have enough water coming into the river that you're not going to continue to lose the decades-old cypress trees and get that replaced with a more estuarine kind of system. Well, they passed a rule. There were also some criteria about what's compliance and what isn't. And as Commissioner Hurd knows from being on the Waxahachie River Management Coordinating Council, almost every year we are not meeting that minimum flow and level. So we're continuing to degrade the Waxahachie River. Not a good situation for us. So back to the basics. 70% of the Earth's surface has water on it. I'm going to try to distill this down so it's easy for everybody to understand. Here we are, 97% of the Earth's water is ocean water. This little sliver in here, fresh water, is 3%. So now we're going to take that 3%, we're going to bring it down into this little pot diagram here, and you see the different amounts right here. A lot of it in groundwater, most of it up here in the ice caps and the glaciers. Actually, accessible fresh water to us is another little tiny sliver of 1%. And then here's the breakdown in what that is. So really, when you look at the big picture, we have very limited freshwater resources that are available to us. Let's talk a little bit about water withdrawal. In the big picture, you look all around the country, or all around the world, and unfortunately you see that the United States is, per capita, one of the biggest users of water. And overall, it's because, for the most part, it has been relatively cheap, inexpensive, and easy to get to, certainly more so in comparison to a number of other areas. What does our water go towards? This is not a chart for here in Florida. It's a kind of a worldwide compilation, and you see most of it goes towards agriculture. But you see the different other uses here. You know, some of it certainly goes to utilities and that sort of thing. Households, 9%. So that's kind of what's going on in the big picture. Let's look at what's happening here in Florida. You often hear the words about aquifers. Well, I'm going to try to take some of the unknown out of all of that. And so this is a map, a figure from the FDEP showing the different kind of surface aquifers in the state of Florida. So this very light green here is the predominant one in most of the state, and that is the superficial aquifer. So that's the shallowest water. Those of us that have wells that go down maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 feet, that's the superficial aquifer. So if you're not right in the urban areas where you're getting water from the county or SMRU or one of the other entities, that's where you're getting the water from, the superficial aquifer. They have a much worse problem of saltwater intrusion. We're going to talk about that in a little bit down here in Dade County, because they don't have this superficial aquifer that is actually bringing water all the way down from Georgia through the state. Down here they've got the Biscayne aquifer, which is a much saltier water quality overall than what we've got. So it's not as easy as all that, so I'm going to take it to the next step, and this is actually showing a sequence of aquifers that we have in the state. And so here, what I'm trying to show is that there is this superficial aquifer, and then in Martin County, down below that superficial aquifer, there's another aquifer, and that's the Floridan. And generally, that has much saltier water. And so how does that affect us? Well, the deal is that the superficial aquifer is nice, fresh water. You can, maybe you run it through a filter, but essentially, if it is not contaminated, you can go ahead and just pump it up and drink it as is. The Floridan, though, the deeper water here, has varying amounts of salt in it. So in order to make that drinkable, you've got to run it through various sorts of filters. All that costs money, so those of you who are on some sort of regional water supply system, you're paying a lot more per gallon or whatever the volume is, based on that utility needing to go through the process of taking those impurities out of it. So I was able to find a graph here that pretty much shows what's going on here in Martin County. It is kind of a conceptual artist rendering, but the idea is the same. That we've got the ocean over here on the east side, here's our barrier island. This particular artist rendering doesn't have a Sewell's Point on it, but the idea here is here's the superficial aquifer. It's going all along in the very shallow depths right under the ground surface. Then down below that, this green layer is something that we call the hard pan layer. It's a relatively confining substrate. Water doesn't pass easily through it. So it is what is separating the nice fresh water up here on the top from the Floridan water, which, as you see, is essentially seawater, or certainly higher salinity than what's up there on the surface. I pulled a quote back. Go back here. From a publication back in the 1990s that at that time they were saying that Martin County is on the cusp of having water problems. For the most part, back in the 1990s, our surficial aquifer still had plenty of water and we were doing okay. But we were on that cusp where the county was knowing that in order to be able to meet the water demands in the future, they were going to have to start changing to this reverse osmosis system. Very expensive process, costing millions of dollars, but because they needed the plan in advance, they needed to get started back there in the 1990s. So now those millions of dollars have been invested, and most of our drinking water, regardless of whose utility you are on, you're now getting water that has gone through that reverse osmosis system. So for here in Martin County, probably, I'm going to owe my thanks to John Chickey for helping me understand all of this. The best water in the county is up here in Jensen Beach. Specifically, right up in here, you can still use a surficial aquifer, a shallow water well. And the reason for that is, I'm sure, back decades ago when the savannas were purchased, people weren't thinking about aquifers and water recharge and that sort of thing. But here it is. We've got whatever it is, 11 miles worth of wetland going from Jensen Beach Boulevard here all the way up to Fort Pierce. Here's this perched pond of fresh water that is slowly percolating through the old sand ridges along the Jensen Beach area here, and it's keeping all of those wells along here in a nice, fresh condition. Those people they're not paying Martin County utilities. They don't even have sewer or water hookups there. The wells are still functional and fresh water because the savannas were purchased for, among other things, that. So now I'm going to take you into this next step of saltwater intrusion. We hear a lot about that, and I'm going to hopefully simplify it enough for you here. That in natural conditions, this is what we've got. Ocean water here, the salt water coming up, and fresh water coming down off the land surface. And so there is this, this wedge where the two join. And this is showing it in a very simplified sort of a process. It's not just a line like that. There's going to be certainly a variation in the salinity. It's kind of a mixing zone. Well, what happens for this whole business of saltwater intrusion is, as we put wells up here on the uplands, they're sucking this water out. And of course, it varies as to the depth of the bottom of that well. But in the big picture, what's happening is, regardless of how deep it is bringing the salt water up more and more. So the more of these wells you put in, the more fresh water you extract, and therefore the more the salt comes up higher towards the ground surface. So that's it in a nutshell. The geologist, and I'm sort of traipsing on a very fine line here. I'm an ecologist, I'm not a geologist. We really need a geologist up here explaining to you the details, and thanks to the Guardians here, we're in the process of getting a geologist to help us understand the implications of the Harmony and the Hope Grove developments to a much higher level than what I'm going to be able to do. But in the big picture, the geologists and hydrogeologists have identified 3 different phases of saltwater intrusion. So this is where we're at in some of the county. We've got these wells here right at the borderline, and so they're pulling that saltwater wedge back. Phase 2 of saltwater intrusion, you've put enough of these wells in that this line has moved further back, and you've now contaminated some of these wells. They're no longer usable for your own fresh water, potable water purposes. And so you've got to start drilling some of these deeper wells down below that confining layer. So we're down here into the Floridan aquifer again, the layer that has the salty water in it. And then they go on to phase 3 of the saltwater intrusion, where you're needing to continue to drill your wells deeper and do a lot more of the treatment through the reverse osmosis system, the filtering out of the salt. So you might ask, where is Martin County in this? Well, I can't give you a good answer because we're in all 3 different categories. Depending on where in the county you are, you may be in a phase 1 area, you may be in a phase 2, or you may be in a phase 3 area. The water management has sort of been the lead in looking at the big picture of what's going on with our aquifers throughout the state of Florida. And this goes back to long before the present governor. The directive from Tallahassee was, don't let the lack of water stop growth. So how do they do that? They start building in the process to start having everybody contribute towards the desalinization process. So I'm sorry that the colors aren't working out real well here, but this is from a water management district figure showing the different well fields in Martin County. And depending on where you live, you may know more or less about all of these. Certainly the big one up here in Jensen Beach, the city of Stewart here, the Tropical Farms facility here, several of them down the East Coast here, including South Martin Regional Utilities. So you probably never think about these kinds of things, but as you're going up I-95, right there at Tropical Farms, there's 95, and here's the big water plant right here. So it's a given, I think, that there's going to continue to be money paid for the reverse osmosis source of the water. You know, we're virtually out of superficial aquifer water. Where the water is and how much you're paying for it is really dependent on who is providing the water to you individually and sort of what the process is for them to be cleaning it up. What we're continuing to do, and whether this is through this wetlands delineation and the whole wetlands protection LDR and the comprehensive plan, is we're trying to protect those areas that allow for recharge of that superficial aquifer. Yes, wetlands do it. They might not do it as well as some of the upland communities, though, because those wetlands generally have a confining layer of some sort down below them. So they do percolate a little bit, but not a whole lot. But the more we have impervious surfaces, parking lots and the rooftops and all that sort of thing, the less water gets through to our superficial aquifer. So this is kind of maybe a hard to follow diagram, but let me just kind of point out some of the high points here. In a natural kind of situation, you've got no buildings or development, and this is generally what's happening. You're certainly losing a lot of water, 40% to evapotranspiration. That's essentially the trees doing their photosynthesis thing. You know, they're using water that gets lost through evapotranspiration. But we are getting some of that water coming right down to our aquifers, 25% of it down, way down deep, and 25% of it into the shallow superficial aquifer. Well, what happens, and we're not going to go through that level of detail on all of these, but you see the more impervious surfaces you have, the more houses and parking lots and that sort of thing, rooftops, the less water gets down here into the rehydrating the superficial aquifer until you get into a Miami-Dade or a Palm Beach County, Broward County kind of a situation here where it's virtually all rooftops. You've got practically no water going down. So unfortunately, Miami-Dade and those other areas are their own worst enemies. They've already got less fresh water available to them, and by paving over everything and not having recharge areas, they're destined to continue to have ever worsening water problems. So some of you recall this graphic that came out by, I think it was Leslie Blackner and some of her colleagues back a while ago, showing that the water situation in peninsular Florida, saying that here we are way down in the south, our superficial aquifer is empty. Well, yes, for individual wells, you may be able to go ahead and continue getting fresh water, but for the larger development kinds of things, that aquifer, that superficial aquifer, is just not fresh enough. You're not going to get it. You're going to have to go down and get the deeper water. So in the big picture, yes, Martin County has been great, and all of those of you who have voted positively for our land acquisition referenda over the years, you've helped acquire these huge wetlands. I mentioned the savannas up here back from decades ago, but the Atlantic Ridge ecosystem, we got thousands of acres there that are nice, good wetlands that are allowing that recharge. Certainly down at Jonathan Dickinson, we got 11,000 acres worth of habitat that is also providing wetland recharge, or superficial aquifer recharge. The big area out here of Palmar and the Cypress Creek property, and here we are out on Swamp Buggies. The property is so wet, that's the only way to get around. Great freshwater recharge areas. So that's Palmar. Out here in the west, we've got Dupuy. This is probably one of the, after the savannas, one of the first properties that was purchased for protecting that groundwater resource, maybe 20 years or so ago. More recently, we've had a number of acquisitions up here in kind of the north central portion of the county. Alapata Ranch, with this most recent half-cent sales tax that many of you supported, we were able to buy another 500-acre tract right in here where we're going to be going in and restoring the hydrologic regime there. All part of this idea to try to keep some water in that superficial aquifer. Last couple slides here, I'm going to lead to what's going to happen in the future. And those of us who have been involved in the conservation battle over the last several years, we know we've got a challenge laid out ahead of us. The first urban boundary buster was up here at Ag Tech. Outside the urban services boundary, how is that development going to get water? Well, as Commissioner Hurd was explaining to us before, they're going to get their water because Martin County cannot provide it to them because we don't have it. They say they're going to get it from St. Lucie County. Well, St. Lucie County up there, the development's immediately north of the county line. They're going through foreclosures. They don't have the money to be able to supply the water down to Martin County. So, for better or worse, that development, who knows if it'll ever take off because of the lack of available water. Well, these next ones that are being proposed right now, we've got this one here, Hope Grove, with their proposed water usage, 3.8 million gallons per day. That's what MTD is, million gallons per day. That's about as much as, these two combined, Hope Grove and Harmony, are about as much as I think the whole county water supply right now produces in a day. So Harmony, the 2,700 acre project to the north, their projected water use is 1.3 million gallons per day. Certainly these are outside the existing urban services district, so the challenge is going to be how will water be provided to those developments. And it is a challenging kind of a situation for us. Oh yeah, I just added extreme sports after it was not approved. Jenny straightened this out there. It wasn't approved, it was recommended for approval. And so that is an important distinction because you'll no doubt get the emails from Donna and possibly from others. When that now gets recommended on up, that means there's going to be a hearing before the Board of County Commissioners, and we're going to be asking you to come in and say, we don't want these projects outside the Urban Services District because there isn't the water available currently. So think of those two, 5.1 million gallons a day that they're going to use. Questions that I'm going to leave with you. I certainly don't have the answers, but where's it going to come from and who's going to pay for it? Don't come. Thank you.